Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of June 10th. And I'm Michael James here in Chicago. And I'm bringing on someone who's no stranger to our show. Been on a number of times. The one, the only Jeff Biggers, who's living out in Iowa, but he's going to talk about somewhere in Italy. How are you, Jeff?
Just great. Always wonderful to be back on your show, Mike. Just great to chat with you.
Well, you know, you have a new book out, In Sardinia, An Unexpected Journey in Italy. And it's an island I don't know much about, and we're going to get into it. But I've really loved your earlier books. You talk about the Appalachian rebel activist Don West. You did a book on the Sierra Madre with the Tarahumara.
Tarahumara, yeah.
And you did a book on poverty in Appalachia. And last time I saw you, we talked together at a book signing you were doing on a book about the resistance. Now you have a book called In Sardinia, An Unexpected Journey in Italy. How about telling us what led you to do this? And it is in the same political vein, or it's a new you that's emerging?
You know, that's a really good point, Mike. All of my books, I think, follow a certain thread of themes, which is I'm largely interested in regions that have been marginalized, regions that have been left out of the historical record, regions that I feel have been misrepresented often in both the historical chronicle, but also in our contemporary journalism. And I kind of stumbled into this, even though as you know well, I come from Southern Illinois. And of course, my people drifted into Chicago in the 50s and 60s, but then we went back to Southern Illinois. You know, I've often felt I've had this need to go to other regions in the world, be it in Appalachia, be it in the borderlands of Mexico, into the Sierra Madre in India, and now in various parts of Europe, like Sardinia and Italy, to look at areas that I feel like have been left out of our historical discussions, and even worse, have been marginalized. And so I think a lot of my work is recovery work. It's historical recovery. It's trying to give the other side, the people who've been left out of this discussion, a chance to tell their story, which I often find is pretty amazing.
Well, I don't know much about Sardinia, and we're going to ask you about that, but let's just jump right off with this quote that I found. And it's from D.H. Lawrence. It's not a quote. It's, he wrote a book called Sea in Sardinia in 1921, just over 100 years ago. And he found little to love on the island other than its perceived wilderness and archaic cultures. You think it's one of the most beautiful places in Italy and in Europe, and you've opened a way for us to know more about it. What's your take on D.H. Lawrence and where he was amiss, and what about Sardinia?
Right. You know, D.H. Lawrence, this masterful writer that we were all forced to read in high school and afterwards.
I never read him, I'll confess.
and a lot of it crossed the paths that you took as a traveler. You know, the first time I read Lawrence, in fact, was not his famous novels that were scandalous and often banned, about sex and whatnot, but he wrote some incredible books about Mexico and Guatemala. And he actually ended up in Taos, New Mexico, where he was very close to Mabel Dodge. And in fact, his ashes have been buried there. And I've always had this struggle with D.H. Lawrence because he came from a coal mining family like I did. Of course, he was from England, and he tried to escape it, and he ran off to Europe and eventually around the world. But Lawrence was searching for the primitive. He was looking for kind of pre-industrial areas. And in this particular moment, 100 years ago, he was living in Sicily, and he decided to run off on a little adventure, and he went to Sardinia. And he was flabbergasted in his journey. In fact, he only spent 6 days there, Mike, 6 days. And he found little that he liked because largely it dispelled this idea that Sardinia was this lost island, pre-industrial, where everybody was primitive and had these kind of ancient rituals. And so here's D.H. Lawrence going around with his thermos. It was one of the modern inventions because obviously he needed his hot tea, and yet he was searching for the primitive. And so he goes to Cagliari and he says, oh, this is a God forbidden town. He goes and gets on the bus and goes up to another town, which he writes off as horrible and dirty. And then he goes to Nuoro, which is one of the capitals in the mountain. And he finds there's nothing to see. And then, 2 days later, he's on the boat and he goes back to Sicily. In less than 3 weeks, he writes this book called Sea and Sardinia. And because he's such a masterful writer, blending, fiction and fact, and he famously took no notes, this book becomes hugely important and hugely famous because it really is the landmark book in travel writing and the book that remains on the shelf for 100 years looking at Sardinia. And he pretty much didn't see anything other than these little stereotypes and captions of his travels. And so here's the funny part. In 1921, exactly 100 years ago, he's looking for the primitive, but in 1921, Antonio Gramsci, the great political thinker who comes from Sardinia, is founding the Communist Party with another Sardinian named Togliatti in Italy. And in 1921, you have the resistance leader, a guy named Emilio Lussu, who was a World War I veteran who wrote a novel that was compared to Hemingway on the front cover of the New York Times. And he comes back and he says, hey, World War I was a war of the poor against poor, and we need to unite. And he founds the first autonomous political party in all of Italy, based there in Sardinia. And in 1921, you have Grazia Deledda, who just a few years later will win the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first Italian woman coming from Sardinia who wins this prize. And she's part of this incredible cultural revival at the Venice Biennale, where all the famous artists and sculptors are. You have Sardinians like Francesco Ciusa and so many other writers and so many other poets and so many other artists who are completely changing Italy and Europe and the world today. And so that was this strange thing I had to look at is, this important book, landmark book, that had defined Sardinia as this left behind, God-forsaken island. And in fact, the truth was, it was this vibrant, beautiful, and very important island that really had shaped Italy and the rest of the world.
Jeff Biggers, you just listed a whole lot of progressive, left of center, clearly important people. And I'm wondering, was that the kind of catalyst for more progressive stuff in all of Italy? Was Sardinia first in terms of producing people who went on to organize leftist political parties? And what's its current situation politically in relation to Italy? I'm not sure. I think Italy just elected someone far to the right.
Right.
And, so I'm not sure if you want to talk about what's going on in Italy, what's going on in Sardinia, how the two mix and one influences the other.
That's a really good question and a very complicated question. The new prime minister of Italy, her name is Meloni, and she's just pretty much a card-carrying fascist, And the sad thing is her father was from Sardinia, so go figure. But
so Sardinia has left and right.
Oh, of course. And in fact, right now, the contemporary Sardinian politics are controlled by a right-wing party. And one of the things I talk about in the book is everywhere I go, so many of these foundational patriots and resistance leaders who were from Sardinia, the idea was, Emilio Lussu would be turning in his grave if he knew what was happening to Sardinia today. Antonio Gramsci would be turning in his grave if he knew what was happening to Sardinia today. So there definitely is a divided, polarized Sardinia as we have in Italy and then the rest of the world. But the continuum here, Michael, that I think you're touching on is the theme of resistance. So here's an island that goes back for thousands of years. In fact, the only ziggurat, and that's those kind of step pyramids that you only see in the Middle East, the only ziggurat in all of Europe is in Sardinia. And it goes back to 6,000 years, a 6,000-year-old pyramid there. That was a major sanctuary and pilgrim site for all the Mediterranean. And then by the Bronze Age, which is 4,000 years ago, Sardinia had a civilization that emerged that really was the cradle of civilization in the Mediterranean, working with Crete, working with all the way back to Cyprus and the Levant in the Middle East. And so you have Sardinia playing a major role. And then if we jump up a couple more thousand years, you have suddenly the invasion of the Carthaginians, the invasion of the ancient Romans, eventually the invasions of anyone you can imagine, from the Goths to the Vandals, eventually the Spanish, eventually the Savoyards, who become the kings of Sardinia and the kings of Italy. And then you have the contemporary Italian government. And throughout all this, there is this theme of resistance, of Sardinians who have been occupied, colonized, and attacked, and ultimately oppressed, who've had to resist against that. And for that very reason, I think they've churned out an incredible level of resistance leaders who've really affected us in contemporary times.
Jeff, give us a picture, a little travelogue or a little view of what the island's like. How many people? How big? What kind of industry, farming? I know that there's a lot of great wine there. Fill us in a little bit about, I mean, already I want to go. And what would I find?
No, it took me 30 years, Mike, to get to Sardinia. As you know, I've been connected to Italy since 1989. And my wife is from Italy, and we were based in Bologna for many years. And we go back and we've raised our children as both Italians and Americans. But it took us 30 years to finally get over to Sardinia because there was this sense that it was over there, it was hard to get to. And I think now in the last 10 years or so, we've had these discount airlines that have completely changed the question of travel. You can get to Italy, you can get to Sardinia as easily as you can get from Bologna to Rome or Bologna to Milan or anywhere. And so
that's a switch, right? Because I think I read that, a lot of people end up going to Rome and Florence, but they don't make the trip because it was a long ferry ride and flights were expensive. Now it's different. Now you got cheap flights, and it's probably tourism is on the rise.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's been, Sardinia has always been characterized as this kind of, fabled beaches. In fact, this week, everybody is looking at Sardinia because the Little Mermaid movie came out. And Little Mermaid was filmed on the gorgeous beaches of Sardinia. And in fact, there's an uptick of 200% in terms of flights that were booked online just this past week. But let's first go back and try to decide where it is. So as we know, here's Italy coming down with the boot, and you have the Rome in the center, and then you go further down to where you have Calabria and whatnot, and then out here is Sicily. And there in the Mediterranean, north of Sicily, is the second largest island, which is Sardinia. But I prefer, Mike, to tilt the map a little bit. There's this great cartographer from Paris named Sabine Ratour, and she created these maps without borders. And she said, instead of us looking at Europe on top and Africa on the bottom, and here's Italy, and Sardinia is this peripheral island, kind of over there, away, meaning that it has no part in history. She said, why don't we tilt the map 90 degrees? And so we do that. And now we have Europe coming down on the right, and it goes ultimately into Turkey. And on the left, we have North Africa and the Maghreb that ultimately winds down, of course, to Egypt and then all around. And there in the center of this map now that we've turned is the Mediterranean. And if you look right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, you have the islands. And this, of course, in the center of the center is Sardinia. And this ultimately is a much more authentic look at the role of the Mediterranean and Sardinia, because the central story of Europe has been the Mediterranean. That was the nexus of navigation. That's where the great ideas emerged. That's where the exchange of civilizations occurred. And central to all that, as we're learning with great archaeological discoveries, is Sardinia at the center of the story of the Mediterranean in Italy and all of Europe.
So if I went to Sardinia, besides drinking some wine, what would you recommend that a guy like me do? Someone who likes politics, likes agriculture, likes old buildings, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. So you have this floating island, and 80% of it is hills or mountains. And so that's why a lot of people tend to stay on these gorgeous, coastal coves. And so here's the first thing. People, oh my God, look at these beaches. It's the Caribbean or the Mediterranean. And they don't realize it was because of a very liberal government in 2006 that took power, that passed very strict environmental protection laws that says you can't build within 3 miles or 3 kilometers of the beach. And of course, there had been a lot of, concrete and poor tourist areas, poor meaning concrete and kind of mass tourism areas. And of course, there was the famous jet set area in the north called the Costa Esmeralda, the Emerald Coast. But this blocked the development of what ultimately would have been a very regrettable decision. So if you go to Sardinia, of course, you're going to begin with these fabulous beaches where literally you're alone on miles and kilometers of just untouched coves and blue waters, and where you actually can see the kind of fish that you imagine. And then from there, you go in and you begin to eat and you begin to drink. And of course, Canada wine is the elixir of the blue zones. You might have heard about the blue zone phenomenon of around the world are these certain areas that have been picked because there are so many centenarians, people who live over the age of 100. And that actually comes from Sardinia. All these villages had so many people who were over the age of 100, and they realized it was related to the fact that they didn't have so much pollution, that they had a walking culture. They drank this wonderful artery scrubbing Canada wine, and they ate really good local food. And then you begin, Michael, this is the fabulous thing, is that you can't go more than 5 or 10 miles without seeing these Bronze Age towers. They're called nuragis. They can be as high as 100 feet. And they're these ancient stones stacked on each other who are still there. And we're talking about 8,000 of these structures throughout the island. It's really incomparable in the rest of Europe. And it's a reminder, once again, of the incredible role that Sardinia played in the Bronze Age. So you're going essentially from incredible nature on the beach, incredible nature in the hills, into the mountains, these beautiful gorges and mountain ranges, to these beautiful archaeological ruins. And then in the evening, you have these fabulous dinners and fabulous drinks. So it's really a mix of all culture and nature that you can imagine. And then we'll talk later about the incredible literary history.
Well, we'll get to that. Then we'll go right into that. I was going to ask you, what is your favorite single, if you have a favorite thing about Sardinia or thing to do when you're there?
That's, I don't know. It's like asking for your favorite moment in Ernie Banks's life.
Yeah, I understand.
But I would say, I've just fallen in love with so many places. It's perhaps for me as a writer, as someone coming from the literary community, is the role of writing and literature. It's the role of poetry. Michael, for centuries, they've had this vibrant tradition of oral poetry contests, ultimately poetry slams, where people meet in the town squares or in other parts, and poets go onto the stage and they throw out a theme and they do these improvised poems, and there's singers on the side. And the singers, of course, come from this ancient tradition called cantu tenore, where it's these chilling polyphonic quartets. And we learned about this, of course, in the 1980s, because Frank Zappa put them onto his albums, these throat singers that were coming from Sardinia. And so that literary tradition to me is fabulous, because you go from town to town or village to village, and you're going to find some sort of music, be it the traditional music, folk music, jazz, Sardinia is exploding with jazz, or classical music. And you also always will find some literary or artistic tradition. And with your music producer, I'll send him a soundtrack we put on Spotify. Because if you like jazz, you have to remember the son of a shepherd, whose name was Paulo Fresu, first heard the trumpet in the village band, then he picked up a flugelhorn, and then suddenly he hears Miles Davis, and he goes to the conservatory. And within a few years, the New York Times is calling Paulo Fresu the heir to Miles Davis and Chet Baker. And in fact, just this summer, he's created a recording studio, the only jazz recording studio in the old milk cooperative where his dad had worked as a shepherd. I think that level of music is kind of amazing. And once again, I can share with you a soundtrack that we have that walks us through the history of much of Sardinia through its different music. They had a woman very similar to Joan Baez. Her name was Maria Carta, and she was incredible. She became Miss Sardinia during the Miss Italia contest. She went to Rome. She started to sing songs. They said, hey, sing your folk songs. And there she began to mine and go back and do research and sing their own songs in her own language. Sardinia, of course, has its own language apart from Italian. Maria Carta became very important as a folk singer, as a political folk singer. In the 1960s, she actually is elected to the Rome City Council as a member of the Communist Party. And she tours around the world, both as a singer, an actress, and a political activist. And unfortunately, she died quite young, but she remains, once again, one of the leading iconic figures that came from Sardinia.
Jeff, one of the things you're known for, besides your writing of history, being a playwright, a journalist, et cetera, is being a monologuist. Have you ever done any monologues at any of these events over in Sardinia?
I'm just now going to be working with theater groups in Sardinia. So we went there in 2016 for a vacation. Like a lot of people, we just went to the beach. And after that, we suddenly saw this beautiful city in the Northwest, this medieval town that was hugging the coast, and the sun was setting, and this promontory was falling into the sea like some sleeping giant. And we said, hey, we have to go live there. And so, in fact, we went back in 2017 for our sabbatical. And for the last 5 years, we've been going back. So this summer, I'll be working with a theater festival. One is called Musa Madre, that works with both Sardinians and expats, Sardinians who've come abroad and now want to go back. And how do we use culture and the arts and the narrative traditions to refine their roots and to, once again, blend the outside with the inside cultural ways. I also will be working with some journalism festivals and some other storytelling festivals. And I'm actually quite active with some archaeological groups who are trying to raise more attention for cultural tourism, get people to come to Sardinia to see not just the beaches, but also the great archaeological sites.
Well, I definitely want to go to Sardinia. And you, at the outset of the show, you talked about your books addressing marginalized communities. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to switch to what could be a marginalized community, which would be progressives in your state of Iowa, where you live a lot of the time. So
Right.
is it okay with you if we flip to Iowa for a few minutes?
Sure.
So what's going on? My people came out of Coyne, Iowa, in the southwest corner. I always loved Iowa. There used to be some great Democrats, Tom Harkin, et cetera, out of Iowa. All of a sudden, in the last few years, we see Iowa as really being in a kind of a conservative camp. And you've been writing stories. I think it was the New York Times, could have been somewhere else, about windmills in Iowa.
Right.
What's going on out there?
Yeah, so the good news is Iowa, no thanks to our politics, has become a leader in renewable energy. Mid-American, which is one of the great utility companies here, has invested billions, and now we get 80% of our electricity from wind turbines, which is kind of amazing. I personally have solar panels, but the wind turbines, of course, have been important. The other part of that is that Mid-American then maintains 5 coal plants in the western part of the state. So it's not an all rosy situation. So what happened, Mike? In a nutshell, you had this state that was united in both liberal and Democrat, rural, suburban, and urban in the areas of Des Moines and then these little college towns, and then a couple of factory towns like Cedar Rapids. And that slowly has changed. I think like the polarization we see in other parts of the country, suddenly you have the blue state type people, fleeing to college towns, to more urban areas politically. So in Iowa City, where I live, it's virtually 85% Democrat. And then if you go 10 minutes outside city limits, it's going to be the complete opposite, be 85% Republican. That kind of polarization has torn the state. You're seeing a massive departure of young people from Iowa, which used to feed in and actually help, mix the state. And now you're seeing young people get educated either from high school or college and then hitting the road because they don't want to be here anymore. There's not an economic future for them. The graying of agriculture, of course, is part of the crisis. We know, of course, during Reagan, we had the collapse of the family farmer. And now with corporate farms shifting, to commodities, be it beans or corn, which really are not eaten, but of course used for livestock or ethanol, has really changed the agricultural communities, which are gutted. These small towns, if you go from town to town, this is where your great photography work is really needed. It's to show how Iowa, like so many other parts of the rural Midwest, has been gutted. And therefore, the people who've remained are often the conservatives, those who are cut off, those who have tended to go with the right. And I think that's what we're seeing now is this domination of small town areas who have a very unbalanced control of power. We've taken over the legislature. Now we have this, governor who's really in the hands of the NRA and the right-wing lobbyist. And you have a liberal communities that are trying to respond some way, but it's just very difficult if we're outnumbered. And I think ultimately it's about the changing world of climate change. Iowa is going to be a critical area because it will be one of these central areas that will focus on food production. And we have to really decide whether we're going to continue with these commodities like corn and bean, or we actually might shift and begin to produce food for the rest of the country. And that can change.
Jeff, it's great talking to you. I always like talking to you. I hope that you recruit a bunch of people from Sardinia to come live in Iowa, stop in Chicago along the way, and I'll talk to you real soon. I'll look forward to seeing you.
Thanks for having me on.